Welcome to our fourth Life After Lockdown event, Restoring Body and Mind. Now, this series aims to visualize what life after lockdown will look like. And today we're looking at what's been happening to our mind and body over the COVID lockdown. So my name is Max Tillman. I'm today's moderator, and I'm joined by Professor Ian Kneebone, a professor in clinical psychology at the University of Technology, Sydney. And we're also joined by Hello. We're also joined by Dr. Joshua Pate, a lecturer in physiotherapy at the University of Technology, Sydney.
G'day.
There we go. Everyone's here. Now, of course, before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. And we would also like to pay respects to elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of this land. Now, we can see our panel on screen, which is always a great start for any online webinar. Now, of course, bear with us if there are any technical difficulties, and please send through your questions. You can see the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have time at the end of the discussion to take some questions from the audience. So let's begin. We'll start with Professor Kneebone. It's a very interesting time to be a psychologist, with the way that we live, work, and socialize being completely upended over the last few months during COVID. Now, in terms of mental health, what are we witnessing at the moment, and what are some of the key behavioural changes that we're seeing take place now?
Well, I think, the impact on mental health has been highly varied depending on personal circumstances. Some individuals have taken the opportunity to, I think somebody mentioned to me, stop the world, I want to get off, and they're doing that and they're enjoying time with their family. But unfortunately, I think the majority of the impacts of the COVID and the related impacts has been negative. So people are more isolated, leading to more depression and anxiety. There are huge socio-economic impacts that are rising. And we do know things like unemployment rates have impacts in terms of suicide rates further down the track. So the new curve, I think, really is the curve in the rise of mental health issues out of this COVID, and that's another curve we need to look at flattening.
So it's obviously we're at a very important point, a pivot point really, in terms of how we see COVID develop as not only a physical health effect, but obviously the mental health component is now what is becoming more serious an issue looking forward. So it must be particularly difficult upon people to have social restrictions imposed by the government as opposed to those that we often impose upon ourselves. So does that have a particularly unique impact upon mental health to have a top-down approach to isolation?
Like, I think it's very interesting, the difference between Australia and the US in terms of the response to government instructions. The US, there's been quite a lot of people concerned and demonstrating against the lockdowns and so on. I think by and large, Australia has recognised the need for the lockdown, and people have been largely compliant. But, we are people who like to be independent of mind and thought and to control our own destinies. And, there is an impact, I think, certainly in terms of doing that. And over time, we've seen, I think, you saw some of the shopping malls and stuff, with loads of people, because there's this pent-up demand to embrace the reduction of restrictions to the extent that, things like social distancing, at least for a period of time, seem to be more relaxed than the government would have it.
And is it a bit of an indication of how much Australians value our freedom? As you've just said, in the United States at the moment and over the last few weeks, there have been protests in many states regarding social isolation and lockdown conditions, and it has certainly brought the understanding of freedom to the forefront, definitely in the United States. But as you've just mentioned, Australians have been quite willing, on the whole, to stay home. And I think that it does raise some very interesting questions as to how much we value our freedom and how we perceive freedom, obviously very differently to the United States. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it comes down to individual values, and I think maybe there's an equation there that the value of independence over above the ill health effects to others. And let's face it, we're talking here about the most affected people by COVID, the most vulnerable are older, frail individuals, either because of their age or because of chronic illness. And I think Australians have appreciated that. Possibly there's a different approach to that in the US, where the values in terms of economic pursuits balance differently against, the health and well-being of others.
Mm. And now, as you've already mentioned, there will come a jump in suicide rates, and that's obviously been supported by a wealth of evidence. Now, Professor Ian Hickey's Mind and Brain Centre at the University of Sydney suggests that COVID-19 could lead to a 25% jump in the suicide rate if employment reaches 11%. So very deeply troubling statistics. Is this a reasonable assumption?
Look, I think so, and I think some of their modelling actually says it could be higher. But the government has, when they've introduced these programs like JobKeeper, that's not just treating the economy, that's treating mental health, because people's occupational function and their vocational ambitions, realising those are central to mental, as well as possibly Joshua can talk about physical well-being, but certainly the connection between those two things and the activity involved in that, the provision of homes and food on the table to people is a very important human function, and those sort of economic devices act to make a difference to those rates. So when those rates have been quoted, they're talking about potentially. So, up to 50% increase in suicide if there's a 15% increase in unemployment Australia-wide. And these things, we can always conjecture about what the future may hold, but certainly the government programs are keeping a lid on that. They've also invested in mental health. Lifeline has got significant extra funding. There's other funding coming through. And if that's successful, we may be able to flatten that curve as well. So I think it's just highlighting the potential rather than necessary reality. But it seems to have garnished the powers that be to put mental health on the agenda and look at making a substantial contribution to flattening the mental health potential curve as well.
Now, Dr. Pate, we'll bring you into this discussion because, as Ian has just said, there's a huge role to play for physical exercise in making sure that we can flatten that curve of mental health issues, which will inevitably arise from the pandemic that we're currently living in. So from your perspective, what are some of the ways that we can combat that COVID slump mentally?
Yeah, I think exercise has kind of been demonstrated to help so many different parts of our health, including mental health. And so that mind and body distinction kind of gets blurry, I think, pretty quickly. There's a lot of research showing the benefits of exercise for like musculoskeletal function, cardiovascular function, neurological function. And I think, like any sort of active treatment where you're doing the hard work has been kind of shown to help in terms of preventing chronic illnesses and also treating some of those illnesses too. So I think for me, exercise and movement more broadly is probably the number one answer there.
And have you, obviously, we've all witnessed how exercise patterns have maybe not necessarily changed, but they've certainly been thrust into the spotlight at a time like this. Now, it would have been very difficult to understand how most Australians view exercise or exercise themselves prior to this, but now it's become very clear that many people are starting to value their exercise a little bit more, if not necessarily for the mental health benefits, but for many because they may not have much else to do. A lot of people have lost work or they've seen their hours cut dramatically. So do you think that there may be a sort of phenomenon going on at the moment where exercise is becoming far more noticeable to people and far more important a thing to do? Because from the sort of statistics that we've been seeing, a lot of people are starting to realize that that physical part of their well-being is something that they may have been neglecting throughout their career. And now is the time to take a deep breath and maybe reevaluate that. So are you seeing a change in the way that we exercise or in terms of the number of people who are actively taking part?
Yeah, there's been a fair bit of research into these kind of physical activity patterns and things like that. And I think it is variable. Like there'd be some people who have a gym membership and obviously aren't going at the moment, and so they might be exercising less. But there's others who haven't been for a walk in years because they were working such long hours and are now in a daily habit of going for a walk and things like that. And from what I can gather, the World Health Organization, different criteria are kind of set for how much physical activity is recommended for different age groups. But I think really the biggest kind of public health benefit we can see is if wherever you're at right now, you can do a tiny little bit more next week and a tiny little bit more the week after, and give your body that time to adapt. Because I think a lot of human tendencies are to just go like full ball straight away. And then that can lead to being discouraged by overdoing it and things like that. So if wherever you're at the moment, you can do a little bit more next week and a little bit more after that, the long-term benefits of exercise should kick in over the long term. And it might be less immediately gratifying, but I think it's worth it from a public health point of view.
And I'll just say, by the way, that as we've been discussing this, we also have a poll underway with some of our viewers at the moment, and the statistics are in, the numbers are in, and it's quite interesting. 46% of our audience are currently saying that they've been exercising less during the lockdown. 37% are saying that they're exercising more, and 17% are saying that they've remained the same throughout the lockdown. So it's interesting to see that the numbers are quite similar between those who've done less and those who've done more. So it's interesting to see how the lockdown has affected different people. And obviously we don't have the sort of numbers on the demographics that we currently have in the audience, but you can get a general idea of the population there. So do you think that on the whole, lockdown has encouraged people to get into exercise, or do you think it's made them more sedentary?
I don't know, like for me personally, work is more busy, and so it's harder to engage in exercise. But yeah, like it's an opportunity to definitely reflect. Like a lot of people aren't in their office, and they're just in a different setting. And so that can be a chance to change habits. And maybe Ian could talk about the challenge between conceptual change and behavior change. Like, so the way that people are thinking is maybe translating to the way that they're behaving, but I don't know, there's a big leap there potentially.
Ian, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, I think, what we have there is there's a lot of change in your poll there. So some people are doing more and some less, and the more lower figure was people are doing the same. And it kind of depends on your individual circumstances. For some people, they've got more time and they're able to prioritise their health more than they have. Obviously, COVID has brought that to people's attention. On the other hand, if like some of my colleagues, your main form of exercise was on your commute to work, that's been taken away from you. It's very easy to, get up early, get on the Zoom meetings, start doing some work, and then have to make the effort to go out. Whereas if it was part of your routine and your regular pattern of behaviour, it's much easier to keep that exercise built in. So I think, as the poll suggests, it's change both one way and the other.
And as we've seen in the poll, obviously there's quite a marketable split between those who are willing to do more and those who are willing to do less. Now, for those who are willing to do more, do you think that these exercise patterns that we've created during the lockdown are actually going to last when things return to normal? And obviously when offices reopen and the 9-to-5 grind returns, do you think that these exercise patterns that we've created during the lockdown are actually going to last? Or do you think we'll have a similar phenomenon to the New Year's Day gym rush, where on New Year's Day, you've got gyms packed out to the rafters of people who've made that New Year's resolution to get fit. And then within a few days, those numbers sort of trickle down until you've got the sort of regular barflies in the gym just as usual. So do you think a similar phenomenon is going to occur, where we're going to have a few weeks or months potentially of people very, very engaged in their physical and mental well-being before things return to normal and the same patterns and issues arise again?
Well, I think, yeah, so from a physiotherapy point of view, yeah, people will change their habits, but it's always hard to predict the future. I mean, it kind of depends how long the lockdown is, and for different people, some people are kind of coming out of the lockdown or their work hasn't really changed at all. And so I guess it depends how much someone has changed, and then when it changes back, how much it actually changes back. I know I know a few people who are, when things return to normal, with the expectation, they'll still be working from home, or those kind of changes, I think, vary a lot between person to person.
I think it depends on how entrenched the new behaviour becomes and the opportunity to do that, depending on how your circumstances change post-COVID. So, if you get this new regular exercise routine going, it becomes part of your usual habit, then it's likely to sustain. But if, however, you suddenly lose the time you had because you're now commuting, that will make a difference. But I think what is very clear, and looking at some of the media reports today, is that most organisations aren't looking at returning to everyone commuting into the business centre in the middle of the city every day. So there's going to be a big change in patterns, and it depends on those opportunities for those people.
And psychologically, how long does it take to change your patterns in terms of maintaining a level of physical exercise? How long does it take to create those neural pathways to make sure that that practice is maintained over time?
Well, weeks and months is the short answer to it. What we do know is the more times you try and change, the more likely you are. So things like stopping smoking, which people might prioritise given the impact of CVD on people who smoke and have respiratory problems, is the more times you try and change, the more times you maintain it, the more likely it's going to become your consistent pattern. Josh might like to comment on that.
Yeah, no, it's very similar with exercise. If people keep making an attempt, eventually it kind of sticks. So.
Yeah, so from your experience, how long does it generally take for those patterns to become set in stone?
Well, there's various experts claiming various different models and things like that. A number that gets thrown around is 6 weeks, but yeah, I guess it's kind of like any habit. So if you can try and make it incidental exercise, so if you can turn this habit into one that's just, it kind of happens all the time. Like before I go to the shops, I'll park further away or whatever it is, so that you're incorporating the exercise into your life. Obviously that has better odds of sticking than if you depend on it for, it's in my lunch break when I'm at the office, that kind of thing.
And I think one of the big questions regarding exercise at the moment is there too much, particularly at a time like this where maybe other aspects of your life may be lagging, if that's work, and you just feel a natural need to fill up the hours another way. And many people may be using exercise to while away the hours. So from your perspective, is there too much exercise? Can we actually be doing a detrimental service to our body by working too hard?
I think if there's a sudden change in the load or the frequency of the exercise, then potentially you're more at risk of injuries and things like that. But in terms of so 1 in 5 Australians have chronic pain, and if they gradually adapt to increase how much they do, my work in pain clinics has definitely shown that pacing, the graded exposure to more activity is a really nice path out of that. But yeah, it obviously varies so much from person to person as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. So obviously we're all phoning in from home at the moment. So it's a very interesting time to talk about that division between work and life now that everything has been sort of muddled all together. So it's interesting to describe this sort of moment. Obviously there is a phrase that comes to mind. It's about not doing something where you eat, but maybe it's not appropriate for the webinar. But what sort of psychological effect does working from home have upon people?
Well, I think, we're only just starting to look at this, obviously, because of the current situation, but it's a different opportunity for different people. So what we do know is it splits a little bit depending on personality. Some people are very sociable. They like going to the work environment. They like the team environment. Other people feel less comfortable in those sorts of environments. So it's an independent factor depending on, things like introversion and extroversion, are very sort of consistently established personality traits and so on. But I think one of the things that I'm more concerned about in terms of the changes that have happened, and particularly the use of substance and such as alcohol and so forth. You were talking about exercise filling the void of the time we have, but my concern is more about alcohol, particularly if we've looked at having the runs of all the wine shops and those sorts of things at some point, is that people don't have to get up early to go to work, so they can stay up the night before. They can drink in the morning and during the day if they're they can mask the blurry eyes on Zoom, and I think I'm concerned about that interacting with the mental health complications that can come from both that and also the socioeconomic and other changes that are happening.
And I think another really interesting aspect to bring up is now, as we're showing right now in real time, we're projecting an identity from what is behind us on our Zoom call. And everyone has been sort of reflecting that same thing, that what appears behind them is how their colleagues will perceive their home life and by extension, their personality and their character. So I think it's very interesting to think about how we want to project ourselves to our colleagues, because obviously it's very different in the office when we have a very stable environment in which we can all operate without necessarily having to give that much away about our personal lives. But that has completely changed. So psychologically, what's the effect of allowing your colleagues into your bedroom or your living room every day?
Well, I think I draw the line at using the bedroom with my colleagues. In fact, where my employer frowns on that to a certain extent. But that said, I think that's very true. You do provide a window literally through the Zoom experience into your life, and that can be useful in some senses. And it depends probably on the relationships with your colleagues. If people are looking things that they want to see you as projecting, then they may well find that and use that as leverage for to pursue their own aspirations in the workspace. But I think it's great fun. We had a virtual hat competition the other day to see who had the silliest hat. I know some colleagues have been looking at the loudest shirt to wear to shock their boss. All these sorts of things, and I think that's a team bonding experience, which really is making up for the lack of the coming together in a more three-dimensional space in the work environment.
So can it be a positive thing, actually, that we're allowing people into our own homes and we're maybe becoming comfortable with one another as a result?
Yeah, and I think if you look at many of these programs where people work together, I think just from personal experience, working on putting all our coursework online, those sorts of things, having to do things at short notice and work with others to make that happen has been a team bonding experience and has led to greater support and appreciation for the different skills and the different personal aspects that people bring to their teaching and to their pursuit in the research environment as well at the moment.
And Joshua, from your perspective, obviously a lot of physios are starting to consult their clients remotely now. So particularly in an industry like that is obviously by nature very tactile, it would be interesting to now see the way that work has to continue when you're not in the same room as your client. So across the industry, what have you been picking up as to how effective this is?
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic about this. My experience is mostly with treating people who have persisting pain for a long time. And the evidence for treatments in terms of long-term benefits are active strategies. And those things don't necessarily mean having a massage or having someone push on things. There's not very good evidence for any of that to have a long-term benefit. It might provide a short-term relief, but there's even potential evidence that it could kind of create this reward where you become reliant on a passive strategy. And so
like a Pavlov's dog sort of situation. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's right. Yeah. And I think potentially the lockdown's kind of getting rid of some of that, those passive reliance on the passive strategies. And it's meaning that physios particularly are going to have to innovate, and people who are based in exercise, like that kind of realm of treating people, are now focusing much more on things that have good evidence, which is like educating a patient about how pain works and what strategies will help, and then guiding them through that process of empowering them to do things for themselves and by themselves. And that model of care works really well. It has good evidence behind it. So I'm part of me is optimistic that we can kind of make the most of this. It's an opportunity to kind of transform our practice across the board.
And obviously in the corporate sector, a lot of people have been talking about the idea that now that working from home has been shown to be a viable solution for a lot of people, that maybe large commercial offices may be a thing of the past. And for a lot of businesses who are going to be looking at some serious bottom line problems over the next few months, maybe selling off commercial real estate could be one of those ways out of the doldrums. Now, is that a similar scenario for you in your industry? Do you think that maybe practices as we know them now may go the way of the dodo, and we may have a more remote access style of consultancy after this?
Yeah, I definitely think there's going to be some sort of mixed form. Like there's some physios who the initial assessment definitely requires physical hands-on. Like me teaching musculoskeletal physiotherapy, you really need to do a physical assessment and thoroughly make sure there's nothing concerning going on before prescribing exercises or whatever the treatment may be. But there's a potential that once someone is set up in a good habit and heading in a good direction, that those check-in follow-up appointments could be done remotely, and there's new technologies being developed all the time that can enable that. And I think that's really exciting, that like potentially people can more efficiently be treated. And that the exciting thing, I think, in a country like Australia, where we have just these city centres and then lots of people who aren't able to access that, is that the internet is allowing access on a global level to high quality education, to evidence-based treatments, and those things that we like from a research point of view really want people to access. So yeah.
And we were speaking about this earlier actually, but I'd like to touch on it again. Now, obviously you've debunked some of the myths surrounding the physio industry. Maybe massage isn't the be all and end all, which is a very interesting conclusion to get to. But a lot of people are now coming to terms with their home workstation. They're trying to understand how best they can design their workplace, not only for their physical well-being, but obviously their productivity. Now, a lot of talk is regarding ergonomics. It's become one of the fad words of the last few months. And as you've mentioned in the past, actually, there's some interesting evidence either way of the debate to attribute towards ergonomic design. Do you think that we're entering a phase where ergonomics is becoming far more important to people? And in that case, is it actually worth the time?
I think it's not as much of a concern as it's made out to be. So a lot of money gets put into ergonomics, and it gets made from the industry. And I don't want to go out picking one particular aspect of healthcare saying that there's no evidence for it, but the jury is kind of out. We don't know if it's worth investing thousands of dollars in an appropriate ergonomic setup. Like there's no evidence that it's going to help, but there's also no evidence it's going to harm. So I guess for the individual, it's weighing up the costs and benefits. Like for instance, I'm currently standing up. And I think like the phrase that maybe is helpful at the moment from my point of view would be, your next posture is your best posture, rather than focusing on this, I must sit down in a really comfortable chair and sit up straight. And that hypervigilance is potentially going to cause more issues down the track than just regularly keeping moving every now and then, every half an hour or every hour, just standing up and moving your body around. I think that is a better long-term strategy than worrying about buying something off an infomercial.
Far more cost effective as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So Ian, what are your thoughts on that? Because obviously there's a psychological element to people thinking that they need to buy a $10,000 chair in order to feel comfortable and be productive from home. So do you think that the psychology plays quite an important role in this fad?
Yes, it's interesting. I think, you can see that I'm wearing a jacket and a semi-formal sort of shorts today, and I think that's because this is an interview where I'm being asked for professional expertise, and I think those things in terms of what's called stimulus control theory add to your ability to perform in certain settings, and particularly for more important meetings. I've started doing that. If you're sitting here in your footy shorts, unshaven and stuff, your performance, I don't think, is the same. And psychology certainly supports that. But $10,000 for a chair, I'm not convinced of that, and I'm not sure the tax office would be either. But you can always try.
Yeah, it's quite a business expense. So you're saying that there's evidence to put behind the argument that it's important to dress the part, essentially.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, we are all shirts, which is very good. It would have been quite ironic if you weren't. I'm not wearing footy shorts, I'll just tell you that. Now, we'll just quickly jump back to this idea of we'll jump back to the idea of a second wave, because that's something that's appeared a few times in the conversation. Now, the World Health Organization on April 10th have said that lifting restrictions too quickly across the globe could lead to a deadly resurgence. Now, it's not without precedent. Historians agree that Armistice Day in November of 1918 was actually a key moment when the Spanish flu re-emerged and a new spike in cases developed, because obviously people swelled out onto the streets to celebrate the end of the war. So what is the psychological effect of that fear of an impending second wave? And could it actually have more an effect upon people than the actual pandemic itself?
Well, I think it's a very real fear. I mean, there's certainly, as you said, precedent for that having happened. But we do know that, Australia is a little bit in times of, having a very first response is that other people like Germany have lightened up first. And what's happened there is that they've had to lock down certain regions of the country when there's been spikes. I think the really important thing that's changed in the message from the Prime Minister and the Premiers has been, if we lighten up, if we reduce the level of lockdown, there are going to likely be more cases. And I think that's helped people to realise that there will be more cases. And let's face it, if there are more cases, there's more chance of morbidity and mortality. So that will ultimately is a judgment call that we're making. But there's many things we do that have risk in them that we allow. I think when we've talked in the past about, you drive a car, 1,000 people die of car-related injuries in a day, and we tolerate people driving cars despite that.
And for all our Sydney-siders tuning in, you may have heard that Inner West Council Mayor Darcy Byrne last week in the Herald, he warned those who were chomping at the bit to get back out onto the Bay Run in Sydney that they should hold off to avoid an influx of runners for the exact reason that we're discussing now, a potential second wave. So, Dr. Pate, what are your thoughts on that, on the idea that it's important to maybe keep exercising at home as opposed to getting out into the streets again?
I don't think there's a rationale to not go outside. I think it's just important that we consider the implications of spreading a viral illness. So yeah, like if we're too close to someone, or we're running right behind someone, or we bump into someone, obviously there's greater risk. So I think the government's following expert advice, and we should listen to what they say in terms of what's allowed. And if there's too many people in one particular area exercising, and we're allowed to go outside, I think there's no harm in going somewhere else for a run. As hard as that can be, the Bay Run's a really nice spot, so
yeah.
pick your decision.
Now, it's interesting that you bring that up, because particularly in the tourism sector and the airline sector, a lot of discussion at the moment is around the fact that economy class, as we all know it, may cease to exist, and being seated three abreast may be a thing of the past, because those fears about infection are going to permeate for years to come, psychologically at least. That memory of what we've experienced is going to last for a lot of people. Now, obviously, the airline industry may fundamentally change. People may not be as crammed on an aircraft as they were in the past. Do you think the same thing's going to occur for gyms and potentially recreational sport?
Yeah, I think it could. Like, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. Sport's an interesting one. So there's a lot of, at the moment, it's kind of on hold, and we don't know if sport's going to resume, particularly contact sports. So yeah, it's an opportunity, I guess, for people to try different forms of physical activity. There's lots of different options out there. So hopefully, people listening can reflect and use this as an opportunity rather than seeing this as a frustrating time where they're missing out on their favorite thing. They may start doing something different. And I think, our expectations of what might work and what's best are going to shape and influence the symptoms we feel afterwards and the enjoyment we feel during it. So I think, aligning something with what you enjoy doing is a really good idea, rather than just following the advice of your neighbor or whoever it is, telling you that you must do some certain movement or some certain exercise. It's important to do something that you like doing.
I think it's really interesting to see that Qantas recently announced that they wouldn't be doing social distancing within a flight, even if they leave a space between you. There's only 60 centimetres difference, and so on. And they're saying that, and that's a choice that may be slightly increasing the risk. But as I was saying before, it's the economic impact versus the level of risk, which is what the government is dealing with every day. And the fact is, maybe you'll take that risk rather than pay $10,000 to get to the Gold Coast.
Yeah, well, it's one of those questions that a lot of people are going to be asking themselves, particularly those in policy making positions, because we do have to strike that balance between protecting the future of the economy and making sure that we don't see another spike in cases and then fatalities as well. Now, on that topic, Ian, you spent many years with the NHS, which is currently dealing with an enormous amount of cases, around 250,000 and 35,000 deaths. Now, what are your observations about the difference between Australia's healthcare system and obviously the response that we have had to the pandemic, and then by extension our roadmap out, and the situation in the UK at the moment?
Well, I think it just shows what it could have been. Now, the reasons that the infection rates are different and the death rate is much higher, we don't really know. It could be everything from whether, the fact that many Australians have been immunised with BCGs early on, those sorts of things. But I can tell you from personal experience and contacts I've had with people in Britain, is the impact on there is just massive. 35,000 deaths, we've had 100. In terms of the health systems, look, the NHS is one of the best health systems in the world, but in this occasion, it seems like either its masters or it's the government were not well prepared, and certainly they didn't lock down the country in terms of overseas travellers early enough. And we're judging this with a lot of hindsight, of course, which is always 2020 hindsight. It's always very good, but it's my heart goes out to those people. I've seen pictures of my colleagues in hospitals, with the ones who are lucky enough to have PPE. And, I think there was something in the media about people putting yellow hearts because they couldn't have funerals. So they're putting yellow hearts on their windows. And if you know a lot of the UK, it's very close together. So, you'd walk around a neighbourhood and there'd be these dots of yellow hearts. And that really, really brought it home to them, just what an impact this virus is having. And it also tells us what we've been able to do by locking down early, closing the borders, those sorts of things. Let's cross our fingers we don't have a second wave, but it's very sobering to talk to those people and see those statistics. Literally this morning I spoke to somebody who can't see her mother who's passing away from cancer in hospital because of the current situation there and the demand on the services, and also protecting both her mother and herself.
And obviously in Russia at the moment, there's a controversy surrounding the number of deaths being attributed to COVID-19, and the Kremlin are being accused of essentially keeping their official numbers of COVID-19 related fatalities much lower because they're attributing existing conditions in many patients as a cause of death, as opposed to complications from COVID-19. So that's a very interesting perspective to take, because obviously that fatality rate is a very large indicator to many other countries of, first of all, how well you're capable of dealing with the pandemic, but also how developed your country is, how effective your healthcare system is. So it's an indictment for many countries upon their ability to care for their citizens, particularly in countries like the United States and the UK, where the impression is that they're some of the most developed countries in the world, and then we've seen them get catastrophically affected by COVID-19. So do you think that the way that we understand the success of a country, the development of a country, is going to change after this? Because the curtain's been drawn back on a lot of large countries and the failures of their healthcare system.
Look, I think that judgment's certainly already happening, and from the world's top economies have had a lot of deaths and so forth. But there's been a long commentary on the lack of access to quality healthcare in the US for large numbers, millions of their citizens already. So I don't think this is anything new. And also those countries make a difference, certainly in the US, as we talked about earlier, possibly making different judgments about risk and risk to economy versus risks to those who are frail and older. So I think that there's a variety of judgments you can bring into bear that relate to those cultural differences and so on. I do believe passionately in the work of the NHS in the UK, and it's always a resourcing problem. But they've had a similar problem to the US when they spend a third per person GDP on healthcare that the US does.
And Joshua, do you have any thoughts to add on that?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, it's probably more a psychological thing to
Mm,
analyze other countries' productivity, but yeah, even just from the healthcare point of view, like different hospitals are functioning in different ways, and they're being compared, and there's just been an enormous surge in the amount of research that's being done and prioritized by different labs on doing research related to coronavirus. So I think it's changing, yeah, the landscape in so many different settings. I heard someone say recently about how it's kind of like we're in a global experiment where different countries are trying to work out and make different decisions based on different outcomes. But in reality, there's some countries that have had a huge influx and their ICUs are full. And then there's other countries where there's still resources available. And so maybe they're on the side of taking more risks.
mm. Alrighty, well, we'll jump to some questions now from our audience because we've been getting them in a slow drip throughout the course of the conversation. So what we'll do now is I'll jump to some of the questions and feel free to join in. So our first question is from Arno Schaff. And the question is, what degree do you think, when will normal return? Now, obviously, it's going to be a new normal, potentially, not the normal that we were used to. But what are the panel's thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think we know. This is the biggest challenge, and we're taking it one step at a time. It depends on the likelihood or the actual occurrence of a second spike in cases, those sorts of things. So I think everyone is certainly saying, you know, the 1 or 2 years it will take to get a vaccine is at least a minimum figure.
Mm. And Josh, you have anything?
But if that comes earlier, of course, party time.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. It's been interesting seeing people just celebrate even the small relaxations. And if the restrictions increase again, I'm sure there's going to be this up and down moment. And so I don't know, yeah, normal may not be the same as what it was. And I guess it really depends on what happens, and we can't predict the future at this point. Be nice.
Yeah, exactly. The crystal ball isn't available on Zoom, unfortunately. But we've got another question from Matteo. Matteo asks, could we see exercises like Pilates and yoga taking a bit more of a forefront as we look to maintaining that natural rhythm of life?
Yeah, I can definitely comment on that. I think they've been increasing in popularity. If you think about, so the condition that has the biggest economic burden is low back pain across all medical conditions, and a lot of people are doing things like Pilates and yoga as a treatment, and they haven't been shown to be superior or inferior to other exercises. And so, my recommendation with those kind of things is there's good evidence that doing relaxed breathing and going for a walk and getting outside, being active are good things. And if you can weigh up the costs and risks and benefits and make a decision at a personal level, that's probably the best way forward at this point, until there's strong evidence in favor of one approach to another. I think it comes down to personal preference.
And is it important to sort of ease yourself back in to physical exercise as opposed to go from sitting on the couch all day for the last 3 months to going back into a 10-kilometer run? Is it important to kind of ease yourself back in, as you actually mentioned before, your next posture is your best posture? So it's sort of like kind of a sort of laissez-faire approach to getting back into exercise. Do you think that it's important to take those baby steps?
I think it depends on your priorities. Like if you really wanted to run a marathon tomorrow and you're happy to put up with the potential of having an injury, then you might choose that. But I think for the majority of cases, most people want to have long-term, better quality of life and better physical function. And so for those goals, I think it makes sense to do a gradual return to movement. So stepping up at a frustratingly small amount at a time, those incremental increases is definitely the ideal approach in terms of allowing our body to adapt. But I mentioned the word frustrating. It is not easy to do, and it's really hard to stick to a plan when you have other symptoms like pain going on. So getting someone to support you, even if it's via telehealth, getting a health professional involved is a good move. I think we're realizing more and more, like the evidence over the last 20 years for exercise and movement like there's a phrase, movement is medicine or motion is lotion, that kind of idea that exercising gives you so many different benefits. I think, yeah, hopefully this is a chance for people to prioritize that more. And I definitely want to encourage that message if it can be encouraged anymore.
Yeah, I think it is an opportunity now for people to consider health and how important it is. A lot of us take it for granted, but now we've seen, particularly if we watch the news and overseas, about just how vulnerable we really are. And, people's values and priorities may well change out of this, and that can be a really good thing.
Now, this next question from Louise. Louise asks, what are the panel's thoughts on Sweden's approach and their rise in deaths, particularly in nursing homes? Now, obviously, in the last week, we've seen that Sweden have recorded their largest ever fatalities in the country's history. Now, obviously, that's through a century or two. We've had many world wars, and obviously those figures are stark reminders that this is a pandemic the world over. And as we've mentioned earlier, a lot of countries that we never would have assumed to have issues during a time like this, suddenly that curtain's being pulled back and it's being revealed that the calamities are across the board because certain countries aren't getting an easier deal at all. So what are your thoughts on Sweden's approach, and particularly, as Louise mentions, the rise in deaths in nursing homes is a really big issue. We've spoken a little bit about mental health, and obviously the mental health of the elderly is a factor that maybe hasn't been raised in the media as much as we would like. What are your thoughts on that, Ian?
Well, I think, I think it has been a little bit in the media, and certainly Scott Morrison was talking about the importance of people being accessing visitors, and that being a very a thing that should be attended to by nursing homes. Unsurprisingly, given the nursing home experience in southwest Sydney, people have been very concerned in many nursing homes. I'm sure for their best interests of their residents have tried to literally lock down and prevent new people coming into the environment. But you've got to balance that against the importance of those visitors to the people who are frail and elderly in those facilities. I think the nursing home question, I think they raised that there should be investigation into the nursing home here. I think, quite sobering is the fact that I think there's 350 nursing homes in the New York area where at least 10 residents have died, something along those lines. So that would be investigating 350 nursing homes. I think as a base approach to this, we should understand that this is a COVID-19. It's a very, very difficult thing to control, and it can be deadly, and the people most at risk are older people. That's not to say we shouldn't take every precaution we can, but getting that balance right is very difficult, and that's been demonstrated, as I say, in New York, but also, of course, in Sweden and in the UK, where for some time they didn't include the deaths in nursing homes.
And we have a follow-on question regarding this, which is something I was actually planning on bringing up myself. So it's good to see that the audience share my opinions, but we've spoken about Americans' understanding of freedom and the fact that a lot of the restrictions across the states in the United States have been protested against by many, many people. And indeed, Donald Trump, the president, has obviously commented on a lot of the states imposing restriction lockdowns. Now, do Australians have a different understanding of restrictions as Americans? And what does that say about our national persona?
Well, I think it's to our credit at the moment, is it not? We've managed to, at least at this stage, dodge a bullet. So I think what we've been able to do is to accept the restriction on freedoms for the greater good, and particularly the greater good of those who are frail and elderly. And, I'm sure there's some philosopher who said once you judge the quality and the esteem of a country by how it looks after its most vulnerable. And I think we've got a very good record in that stead.
So do we not share the American sentiment of live free or die?
Well, I think it might be live free and die in terms of the current environment. But I think it does. We have got a different sense of values to the American system, and that balance against the importance of one's personal rights over the rights of others, and that's a different balance for different people.
Yeah, I think for me, in hospital settings and working with health professionals, in those contexts, I think working with vulnerable populations, you just see how burdensome this condition can be. And I think sometimes that gets hidden in different countries with the media and things like that. So it can be it really depends on what you're being exposed to. I guess that's influencing your opinions as well.
And we've got another question from an anonymous source. Do you think government, both state and federal, is doing enough to support mental health? And what areas do you think need more support post-COVID?
Well, perhaps that's one for me. I mean, I think that they have announced extra funding for those sorts of organisations. There's been funding going to Lifeline, which is, of course, the crisis intervention for people with suicidal ideas. They've also invested in some of the new developments with Headspace, which is particularly paying attention to younger adults. That's very important, I think, because they are the most vulnerable. As we've seen, the younger are more affected by the socio-economic changes. So I think the will is there and the money's there at the moment. Time will tell whether it's enough.
And Josh, what are your thoughts on that? Because obviously mental health is something that's being mentioned a lot, but obviously your expertise is in the physical side. So do you think that there needs to be more of a state and federal approach to improving the sort of structures and infrastructure we have to make sure that there is available resources for those who may, first of all, need physical rehabilitation after lockdown, or those who are just willing to get their physical well-being into check?
Yeah, I definitely think it's going to be an evolving question. So it depends on how many people are accessing and demanding resources in order to be able to allocate adequate resources. So I think the answer to that will hopefully get better and better as we have more data and more studies get done on how much rehabilitation is needed and things like that. But yeah, it's a really hard time. I think there's a lot of people out there who were going to have elective procedures and had really high expectations that things were going to change for them, and now those things have been put on hold, and they kind of feel a bit stuck at the moment, and that's a valid concern. And so it's it's balancing those benefits and risks. Like how soon can we get people accessing these mental health resources or these physical resources, and maybe some more of a push towards telehealth where that has been shown to be effective is appropriate, but there's limits on telehealth as well, I suppose.
And obviously for those who are struggling at the moment with mental health concerns, obviously Lifeline is available on 13 11 14, and also you can head to www.health.gov.au/COVID-19 support. So there are certainly avenues available at the moment to make sure that people can keep a check upon their mental health, which at a time like this is really important. And it leads to another question from the audience, which I find really fascinating. Should we check in on team members or colleagues who like to have their screens off during Zoom meetings more than others? Do you think that it's important to ask people if they're okay, if maybe they aren't as willing to share their face and their home with their colleagues?
Look, I think, we have a day, certainly in New South Wales, I think it might be Australia, we call it Are You OK Day. And I think more than ever, we've talked about the impact of this on families and so on. Some of the things that are more difficult are things like the increase in domestic violence, those sorts of issues that are perhaps on the rise. And I think for that very reason, and also mental health and also the pressures on families and the consequences of that, substance and things, I think, yes, ask, are you okay? It's not just for one day of the year.
And Josh, do you have anything to add further to that?
Yeah, well, the team I'm working in has regular catch-ups to where the boss checks in, but I also think that, the responsibility probably shouldn't just be on managers to check in, but we should try and be looking out for each other. It's a really interesting and difficult time in a lot of ways.
And just one last question. What do you think is going to happen to that understanding of sort of water cooler conversation? The way that many people socialize at work is clearly very different to the way that we socialize in our usual sort of circles. And in fact, many people have a very different identity at work from the one that they have at home or down at the pub. So do you think that the way that we communicate and socialize with our co-workers is potentially going to change forever?
It probably depends. So if there's a vaccine and everything kind of goes right back to what we were talking about was normal, then that's what might happen. But if we need to keep social distancing for an extended period, that I'd imagine that will certainly change our social interactions. And we know, like from a health point of view, we now think about the biopsychosocial model. So there's the biology, yes, but there's the psychology, and there's also these social elements. And I think often the social elements get neglected because we just kind of don't see the importance of them. But maybe times like this where we've had lockdown are really highlighting the human need to be in communities and to be with other people. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting thing depending on values.
And
certainly there's been an increase in the amount of loneliness. The ABS statistics recently on the, small survey, 1,000 people, but 22% of people are feeling more loneliness, and particularly women in this time. So I think, it's not, while there are some benefits for some people in terms of, pausing and taking some time to consider things and reevaluate their circumstances, there's also some real impact on people in our community. Whether we'll get back to the same sort of social interaction at workspace, I don't know. There may be a complete change in the amount of time and numbers of people, certainly for a period of time, going into the workplace. So the way we'll interact, I think, is inevitably going to be more online. And, you talked about that window into people's lives. We're going to get better at managing that and working forward to make sure that our needs are met in a positive way. And hopefully the science of exercise and physiology and psychology can all make a difference to that.
And we'll get to one more question before we leave. So our parting comments now. What are some ways that we can embrace the lockdown? Obviously, over the last 45 minutes, the conversation has been quite doom and gloom about sort of many of the negative effects of the lockdown. But then again, we've had some brief rays of sunshine in there. So what are some of the positive things that we can take away from this experience? And what are some of the ways that we can learn to love the lockdown?
Well, I think we have answered some of those in the terms of re-establishing or re-evaluating one's values. So is the pursuit of, the next BMW or the next posh car more important than spending time with your family? And many of my colleagues have said to me, it's been great, surprisingly, to spend time with my children in a way that I haven't been able to when, I've been commuting and working long hours. So I think sort of embracing that opportunity to be with family, if that's a positive thing for you and so forth, so that you will reschedule more of that time going forward.
And Josh?
Yeah, and I think in terms of just being more physically active, that message of gradually trying to do a little bit more than yesterday or than last week is probably the biggest take home I can think of in terms of making the most of a pretty horrible scenario. So.
Alrighty, well, that pretty much brings us to the end of our discussion. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you, obviously, to our panelists, Professor Ian Kneebone and Dr. Joshua Pate. Thank you all for being a part of it. Now, our next Life After Lockdown event is this Tuesday. It's going to be Law in the Time of COVID-19, which sounds fascinating. Now, you can register at uts.edu.au/events. Or if you would like to try a UTS taster course, which sounds very appetizing, you can visit open.uts.edu.au/for free online courses. So this webinar will be posted on YouTube soon. Look forward to seeing you all there, and thank you very much for joining us.